Hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the final panel for day 2 of the Peace Studio Summit. As a speaker and consultant, I've dedicated most of my life to the work of diplomacy. I'm Nigerian, but my father was a diplomat, so I grew up in 5 countries and 4 continents. Today's panel is all about that. Unfortunately, we're living in a moment where peace won't be possible until we begin to figure out just how to get along with those that we have ideological differences with. We've resorted to name calling and disparaging debates on social media and to writing people off where we think there's no way I could get along with that person. And relearning to connect with one another, to rise above our social media echo chambers and to treat everyone with the human dignity that they deserve is hard. I know it's hard, and I know you know it's hard. But if we're ever really going to move the needle forward on building a more just and equitable society, then these type of conversations must happen. They need to happen. And tonight, I'm excited to be joined by 4 experts in the ever-growing bridge building space, with clinical psychologist and author Anatasia as Kim, executive director of Louisville Pride Foundation, Mike Slaton, Braver Angels national leader, John Wood Jr., and while unfortunately the community director of People's Supper cannot be here with us tonight, we have the community manager of the People's Supper, Mary Pauline Diaz-Racine. Thank you all for being here today.
It's beautiful to be here. Beautiful to be here.
Pleasure's mine. I'm excited to get into this. So the first question that I have for you all is, most of you have mentioned in the past that finding common ground is essential to having difficult conversations. I would love to start by asking each of you what specific ideologies you're trying to bridge and what that common ground looks like for you in these specific settings. If we can start with you, John, and then we'll go to Mike, Mary Pauline, and Anastasia.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I appreciate the setup. So yes, so Braver Angels is America's largest grassroots organization, bipartisan grassroots organization dedicated to political depolarization. But the way I like to describe it is to say that we are committed to reviving the communal spirit of American democracy. And so, we're focused on doing something that everybody will agree is very easy to do these days, and that's get progressives and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans together in a room, together in spaces in various institutional settings to be able to engage each other on the basis of common humanity, learn from each other's experiences, and figure out how we can share a country together so that we can leave it for the next generation, because our kids are going to be living with each other and so are our grandchildren's children. And so, we have to have an investment in that common dignity. But within that, of course, you have racial divisions, you have cultural and religious divisions, and all sorts of other things that make it imperative for us to begin to figure out how we can have some language that allows us to cross the divide from social justice culture on the one hand, for example, to more traditional conservative and religious cultures on the other, and everything in between. So the spectrum is wide.
I love that. The spectrum is wide, the intersections exist, and it covers a lot of the social constructs that we've all defined for ourselves. What about you, Mike? What common ground are you trying to educate people on?
Well, specifically in our work at the Louisville Pride Foundation, we're an LGBTQ organization. So oftentimes we're talking about bridging divides around people's beliefs around LGBTQ issues, but there's also a lot of divides within the LGBTQ community, and divides beyond just the sense of, is somebody pro or anti-LGBTQ? One of the things that we work on is anti-racism, both within and outside of the LGBTQ community, because our community is a microcosm of the larger community, and we have all the same fault lines, all the same rifts, all the same challenges. And being part of one marginalized group doesn't make you immune to discrimination, prejudice, all the animus towards other folks. So there's really, I don't really necessarily think of it as a single ideological ground that we're trying to cover, so much as not to be too much of a hack, but to quote our mission statement, we like to say we are bringing communities together through collaboration, empowerment, and celebration. And we were really intentional that we said communities, plural. We're really trying to bring all communities together.
Yeah, and I think you're building on what John was saying. A lot of this is very hard to narrow down into one because we're rarely one thing, and so communities and the intersections exist there. Mary Pauline, what about you?
Yeah, feeling a lot of resonance. Where the People's Supper began was really in the wake of the 2016 election, like so many. And so our work started from that conversation around political polarization and kind of the entwined issues such as Islamophobia, anti-immigrant hate, things like that. But like has been said, we tend to focus on this notion of common humanity and working with different kinds of communities. For us, that's looked like municipalities, faith communities, workplaces, different kinds of groups, and really asking them to name their own reality of what needs healing here. So really for us, a lot of it is about starting from that point of what is the tension that's causing pain here? And also, as Tayo, you were kind of alluding to, these are all very intersectional experiences. Yeah. So what are kind of the different intersections, the different experiences that are tied up in this? Like, we can't address polarization if we're not addressing racial justice and how our identities show up in this work too.
Yeah, it's not either or. There's a lot of nuance and a lot of lived experiences in between. Anastasia.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. Really great to be here with all of you. So I want to say that first to start off. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I've been doing this work both in a teaching capacity, writing, training on how to have constructive conversation using psychological science. And what I'm interested in this moment in time is to use psychological science to not just argue about content or positionality, who's right or who's wrong, but do a deep dive beneath the surface to understand what is happening to us intrapsychically, interpersonally, with regard to the strong and difficult emotions that abound when we try to talk about and broach very difficult topics as systemic racism, heterosexism, classism, etc. So I'm really invested in trying to figure out why, regardless of what our position and where our parties and our affiliations sort of lie, what is happening to us as human animals, the social, emotional animals that we are, and we are wired for a connection, and how important emotions are, and how to amplify our collective understanding of emotions and of strong emotions in particular, so that it can be used in the service of our goals versus to hinder and to further deepen the vitriol and the polarization that's been going on.
That's so well said. So let's stay with you, Anastasia, because your book, It's Time to Talk and Listen, serves as a user-friendly guide that helps people engage in effective, compassionate discussions about complex issues. As you just mentioned, you've also mentioned that this guide doesn't serve as a quick fix. Rather, it's meant to be repeated, and mutual efforts need to be, engaged with. And these mutual efforts are supposed to help two sides narrow the differences. But I have a question. What if one is an emotionally charged situation? Like, if we were both in an emotionally charged situation, what advice would you offer to either avoid that tipping point that we often see in the first place, or to de-escalate the situation?
Well, I think any topic or conversation that we attempt to have on some of these very difficult issues are going to be emotional. And I think it would be naive for any of us to think that we're going to enter some innocent conversation about systemic racism in the United States, a pain and injury that is centuries old, and think that it's going to happen like this, or that it is going to be without any active and difficult and strong emotions. So first and foremost, we must expect and accept that there are going to be strong emotions within ourselves and between one another. Conversations are constructive if both people are willing to come into a conversational space, and both people do their part to contribute to cultivate a brave space together. Yeah, that's very, very difficult to do. So the goal of my book is to really bring the reader behind the stage to understand, why are these conversations so difficult, right? And what can we do if we can educate ourselves about what is happening behind the scenes? Now, not every attempt is going to work out constructively. Yeah. So if one party or even both people are not able to manage and de-escalate to the emotion to a point where constructive conversations can be had, then that's actually not the right time. So we have to be attuned to ourselves and each other so that we don't haphazardly just enter, mindlessly, reactively into conversations. Because if we're in that emotional state, right, our prefrontal cortex is often asleep at the wheel. Our capacity to have logical, rational conversation. That's at a time when I have to say, Tayo, like, I'm feeling some kind of way right now based on what you sort of said. I want to take a little bit of time, and can I get back to you? So I think to be mature about understanding your emotion, because there's a point at which I am not very constructive. I need to know that about myself before I enter this conversation that is already going to be charged with you.
Yeah, no, I love that. Be able to name your emotion and then feel your emotion and understand what that emotion needs from you in that moment. And I don't know that many of us are educated on that level. Shout out for the emotional intelligence teachers, but I love that you focused on that. So that's going to set up this conversation, that because I want to move on to you, Mike, because last year, in response to the pandemic, you started a digital pride community conversation series, right? And, I see you there with your lovely mic setup, and I'm sure you were using these in those moments. But in these series, you talked about trans health justice, Black queer culture, immigration, and many other things. Can you talk to us about difficult conversations that are taking place within the LGBTQ plus community in Kentucky? And how do you think the digital spaces like your podcast and the physical spaces like the LGBTQ plus community center you're building support this kind of dialogue? Just to go off of what we just said.
Well, like I said earlier, the conversations that happen and the divides that happen in the LGBTQ community are the same that happen in the entire community, and the issues we're confronting in Louisville are not any different, really, than everybody else all over the country and all over the world. There's a rising awareness over the last couple of years around trans issues, which are a lot different than just other LGBTQ issues. They're in many ways much more complex. You've got issues about healthcare and issues of transitioning, and the legal situation is different. So a lot of people in the LGBTQ community who are not trans don't necessarily know as much about those issues. So bringing those to the forefront, and there's always this kind of, I guess it's maybe a scarcity mentality, abundance mentality issue of how much time and attention we have to talk about issues. Because sometimes when you start talking more about an issue that has not gotten attention, that feels to some people like it's taking away. If we're talking about trans issues more, what are we spending less time talking about? So you need to make sure that you're doing things in a way that's adding to the conversation without crowding anything out. Race and the LGBT community is another really big conversation that's been going on for a long time. It's had new focus on it in the last few years in overall in very good ways. It's very tough conversations as we're talking about today. But, that's something that for years has been, there's a sense sometimes that, well, we don't have that problem. We're all minorities in the LGBTQ community. So how can we be discriminating against each other? And that's just, that we're not immune to the problems of the larger society. But I think creating things like the Community Conversations podcast and places where we can come together, it helps bridge those divides. Because what I think the only thing that can really make change is when we form personal relationships across lines of difference. And so that's kind of what motivates me in all of my work, is how do we bring people together who are not otherwise going to come together, who are not otherwise going to encounter each other? Because in America today, the norm is that you're going to move through your life and you're going to be with people who look like you, people who are your same socioeconomic class, watch the same TV shows, live in the same neighborhoods. To cross lines of difference, you really have to work at it. And so trying to make that easier is really what we're about.
I'm curious, because I do have a follow-up question to that, Mike, because I'm very curious about the digital space, right? We've seen it. You say something and someone can dig up something you said before, and it's very hard for context to show up in these spaces. And sometimes people can either be quote unquote canceled, or you form whole opinions on people, especially with transphobia and homophobia. But you led a digital series, and it sounds like you found a way to introduce compassion in this digital series. So I'm curious to see if you could share some tips on that, because I know many people get into this emotionally charged mindset as well, and they might shoot up something and then they maybe don't want to take it back.
Yeah. I think it all comes down to seeing the other person as a whole individual.
Okay.
You have to, which is the same as when we're talking about promoting diversity and inclusion. We have to see people as whole individuals and not think that we know all these things about somebody. I've just met the people on this panel and I know a little bit about you all, but that doesn't really equate to anything else. I may have in my mind all sorts of stereotypes or generalizations I can make, but I need to set those aside and focus on getting to know you as an individual and asking your opinion, and not assuming that, okay, well, you're moderating this panel, so I bet I know how you feel about this issue and this issue, but getting to those things on a personal, individual level, because that's all we can really do is relate to people as individuals.
That's fair. That's fair. All right. Thanks for sharing. Mary Pauline, in an interview with On Being, which is, by the way, On Being, for those of you that haven't listened to the podcast, great podcast. But the founder of the People's Supper, Lennon Flowers, mentioned that there were a lot of really problematic motivations for some people who were joining the People's Supper. Can you tell us a bit about those motivations and how you and your team learned the difference between safe and comfortable spaces?
I think, there's a lot of resonance with some of the other things that have been said. So for instance, if I think about some of the groups I'm working with, often people will come into a space about political polarization, really wanting to convert the other person, right? Like one side or the other. You're wanting them to change their views altogether, which is not altogether inherently bad, especially when we're thinking about how different views lead to actions that really oppress other people. Or I think about, for instance, on the other side of things, folks who will come into a racial justice series essentially wanting to check off the box, wanting to say like, okay, I've had this conversation, I've met this other person, and now I think I've done my good deed. Now I'm doing the work of racial justice. And so I think kind of building on some of the other things that have already been said, what we've learned, even as an organization, our work started from this challenge of 100 dinners in 100 days, random strangers across lines of difference at tables together, having these conversations. And I think what we've learned is that it takes a lot of intentionality, and it takes a lot of thoughtfulness about who's coming to the table. When we're talking about creating safer or brave spaces, as we are often talking about, and I know Anastasia referred to that as well, when we're thinking about that, we have to think about the harm that's happening for other people at the table too. We have to think about what the conditions we're setting are. So for instance, we've moved away from kind of this one-off thing, because you can't build relationship in a single dinner. You can't do the work of racial justice in a single conversation, in a 2-hour friendship. And we've moved towards what does it look like to really accompany communities over a long period of time as they wrestle with continuous conflict, as this supper's conversation brings up new issues that nobody was anticipating. And a lot of it is really for us thinking about how to be adaptive to that. And also thinking, kind of like Mike was saying about personal story, that we're encountering each other in our wholeness as humans. We're encountering each other not just because of our views, but what we're often doing to open up the space, for instance, is we'll ask people to just tell a story from their childhood that illustrates their relationship with race, right? Like telling a personal story that, as I said earlier, can get to something that facts can't. And so when we are welcoming to the table our whole selves, our human selves, and not just these things that look like what we check off on a ballot box or things like that, that begins to open the way for more trust building. And that's kind of the other thing, is that, like I said, coming in with this expectation that we're going to walk together on this, setting up conditions that say we're in continuous relationship, and setting up conditions that say, I am actually going to do something here because of what I've learned differently. I am actually going to get to the end of this series, or to reflect on myself and to reflect on our relationship, and it's going to take me to a point of social action. So that's also kind of where we've been going, is taking our series to a point of accountability.
Yeah, accountability is definitely key, especially during difficult conversations. So, and I'm sure we'll get to that very soon. But thank you for sharing. I really appreciate that. John, you have an interesting line of work here, sir. Because your work at the Braver Angels focuses on what you call patriotic empathy. It's the idea that our love for our country is shown by our concern for our fellow citizens. Now, from your perspective, what do you think is a productive way of showing concern for one another? And how can one do that constructively through conversation?
Right. Yeah. Well, so obviously there are a number of ways we can show concern for each other. Part of it is by being willing to serve in a community capacity, by being willing to sort of take the office of citizen, if you will, or resident of a particular community, and equate that with a positive obligation to wish to make life better in a material and a social and emotional, spiritual way for the people who surround you. And in the context of conversation specifically, I would argue that that ultimately comes through in our ability to sort of signal goodwill towards the other party, across whatever chasm of difference there may exist on the basis of identity or ideology, philosophy, or politics. And really, that becomes an internal sort of practice, an internal sort of discipline, if one wants to carry that way of being in the world to its sort of fullest application. I try as much as I can to be a student of the philosophy of nonviolence, the philosophy that Dr. King taught and largely sort of developed in the context of the American memory. And it's based on this supposition which says that love is a spiritual power that can be applied to social problems, right? And if we are able to signal, what King termed as agape love, which really sort of translates to the term goodwill. And so I oftentimes use goodwill to mean love, but, getting at the same spirit here. If we're able to signal goodwill towards those with whom we have deep disagreements, I think we accomplish two things. One, we're able to most effectively sort of reach the conscience of the opposition, you might say, by acknowledging the human context of their own particular opinions and lived experiences. We're able to demonstrate to the other parties that we ultimately mean them well, even if we disagree and disagree vehemently on the answer to a given problem or on the nature of social reality. And even if, we don't change another party or establish, a deep relationship, all in the context of one setting, because as Anatasia said, problems and differences that have built up over the course of generations and centuries are not necessarily all going to be resolved in the space of a single conversation. We at least manage to unshackle ourselves from the burden of hatred, of fear, of contempt, and these things that oftentimes keep us rooted in our bitterness because of the pain of our own experiences. And so it is a difficult thing to practice, don't get me wrong, but if one can summon goodwill internally, it becomes the vehicle by which we can pull out the best in other people who exist on the other side of a given divide. And so that's what I try my best to practice in the context of our work at Braver Angels and just living day to day.
I love this. And now I'm going to open it up to all of you. And one thing that I've been curious about is, and I hear it a lot, in my line of work as well, but there's often a distinction between safe space, brave space, comfortable space. And I know you touched on it in Anastasia, but I'm curious to hear what that sounds like to you all when you hear safe space and brave space, because I think it's been used interchangeably, but listening to Anastasia, it sounds like there's a subtle difference. So I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on those things. And then I have a question about another word.
I don't myself use safe space, and rather use brave space, only because I think the word safe has become synonymous with I need you folks who are on the downside of power to make this comfortable and palatable to me, those of us who are in the side of privilege. And so I think that in the language is really, really powerful. Now, language in and of itself could be very limiting, but language in this sense can be very, and it has the cloak and the veneer of promulgating further subjugation for those who are already on the downside of power. So safe typically has translated to the powers that be comfortable. And you can't try to even begin to unpack and mend and heal from centuries old relationship and personal injuries if you are seeking comfort. Yeah. It just cannot happen. They don't go sort of hand in hand. And so I think part of the being brave means I know this is going to be messy. I know this is going to be really imperfect. I know that I'm going to be scared. I know that I might have a difficult time reining in my anger, reining in my righteous rage even, but I'm going to be brave. I'm going to keep showing up and up again. And again, in the same ways that I think John, Mike, and MP were talking about, it's not a one-off. You have to keep showing up to begin to do the brave and the audacious sort of work of the hard work, which is messy, which is difficult, which is imperfect. Yeah, and you show up in spite of that.
I love that. Any other thoughts? In your line of work, do you agree? Disagree?
Yeah, I was to go off of something that Anastasia was saying about continuing to show up. I think of it as less of an issue of space and more maybe as a linear thing, because what I think of is each of these conversations is a single conflict we have in a relationship with the person we're talking to. And we're in a relationship with everybody. It may be a very short relationship. It may be a relationship that happens for an hour or two, and then we never see that person again. But if we think about it in terms of that relationship, and this is an individual conflict, and I use conflict just in a general term, an individual issue with this person, very rarely do we want to throw away an entire relationship over one conflict. Most of the time we want to come out of that conflict with a stronger relationship. And I think if we reframe that in that sense and think of it in that sort of linear, like, okay, if I see this person again in a year, that to me is how I think of these conversations, less about the space it's happening in and more about the relationship I have with that person and where it's going to go.
Okay. All right.
I actually respectfully disagree in some ways.
Hey, we have our first respectful disagreement.
Yeah, and of course, and this is based on my assumption, my sort of projection of, but I think people these days are very quick to cancel over one conflict, or not even, or even in the absence of conflict, like, I know what you're about, Mike. Goodbye, unfriend. And I think that we have this knee-jerk reaction. And so, and I absolutely agree with you that part of it is how we stay tethered to ourselves, our own unresolved traumas and pain, and how we remain connected over the long haul with each other. Yeah. But I don't know. We live in a very knee-jerk reaction friendly culture where we expect a push of the button for things to change and for action to happen. And I think that is really a wrong attitude, in my opinion. And that's why for me, space, cultivating energetic spiritual space is really important for myself, within myself and between myself and you, and sort of other people. And for us together to bow humbly into the magnitude of that space that requires bravery, and I am I don't know, reactive, defensive, neurotic person. So I might, if I get mad, I might be like, all right, Mike, yeah, my birthday next week. Yeah. It's canceled for you. I might sort of go there, but then I need a little bit of time to lick my wounds, if you will, and then to be able to go. But if I have built some opportunities for proximity, I think what John was sort of saying earlier, goodwill that requires constant and relentless, continuous sort of contact, then my capacity to come back to you and you to me is enhanced. And so I really think about it as a space, a spiritual, interpersonal sort of space that we all have to collectively invest in cultivating.
I was seeing nods. Was there anything to add? Was that John?
Well, I mean, I definitely agree with Anastasia that people are quick to cancel. I mean, that's a big part of why we even exist. So Braver Angels began really, our models, and we've got a number of different workshops and methodologies. At this point, our very first one was really dedicated to bringing together sort of small folks from the left and from the right, not to argue or debate politics, but to speak from lived experience in terms of why we see politics the way that we do, in line with the spirit of Pauline's work. Really applying the principles of marriage counseling to these sorts of political relationships, because it is so sort of widespread in our culture. But I think that part of what Mike is getting at, and a big part of what I believe, is that our leverage for change is also contained in our ability to continue in relationship with each other. And to I think part of Anastasia's point, I think that that's a little bit of the short-sighted nature of wanting to be able to just quickly cut people off on the basis of a disagreement. Because once you've cut somebody off, you may think you're playing your best hand to get them to change their mind. But even if they pretend to change their mind, they're doing it out of fear, not out of sincere persuasion or conversion to your way of seeing things. It's through love that you are able to maintain the channel for persuasion, maintain the channel for touching the way somebody thinks and interacts with the world, so that they can expand their mindset and their concept of humanity, right? And again, it is an internal discipline, not an easy thing to do, but I'm not necessarily aware of a technical distinction between braver space and safe space, but just in terms of how the terminology strikes me, it seems to me that bravery summons forth a sense of empowerment from within that allows us to engage in the discomfort and the difficult conversations for the sake of the greater social and personal progress that we want to make. And I think that that's got to be the instinct, because we can't always expect things to be perfectly safe around our own particular sorts of sensibilities, but we can empower ourselves to endure the difficulty and the discomfort and to grow. And I think that that's what we want to see happen for people across the board.
Okay. Now, we have some questions from the audience. And so it goes off with what we were just talking about, cancel culture. So Georgia asks, what do you think are the pros and cons of cancel culture? Do you think there are pros and cons of cancel culture? Very curious to hear your thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Throwing it back at me here.
Everyone and anyone.
Well, I mean, I'll just go really quick and say that, look, on the pro side, I would say that, look, there is a social function, I think, there's a function for social pressure, peer pressure. I mean, some people would even say that, shaming can serve a positive social good. But I think that it can definitely be a double-edged sword in a serious way. I mean, the con is just what we've articulated here, I think, which is that when we're too quick to use that weapon, we can break relationships that break our own ability to be a positive influence and a constructive change in the lives of people who we genuinely need to be engaged with in order to better the larger society with which we share, right? And so we sort of short circuit our own leverage towards constructive social change by undoing relationships through this impulse towards cancellation, particularly when it is strictly reactive and reflexive and sort of, not thought through within the larger sort of context of the impact that you might want to have on the world through preserving a relationship if you can. Which isn't to say that it's not understandable why people want to cut certain people out of their lives. It is understandable. But this is just the calculus, the balance that we have to sort of consider in our minds before we make decisions quickly.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Are there pros and cons to cancel culture?
I think I would add, I mean, you've heard me talk enough about accountability. So kind of on the flip side, the question that comes to mind for me is, do I want to define a culture based on who doesn't belong, or do I want to define a culture and a community based on who does? I think there's a big difference between cancel culture and harm reduction. So for instance, on the practical level, when we're planning suppers, we often get questions about like, well, can I really invite a neo-Nazi to this table? And the answer is often no. It's no, you can't. Like, that is not beneficial. This is not necessarily the space. there may be other spaces where we engage that. And again, it kind of goes back to the other question of what's the space we're building together? What's the community and the culture we're building together too? And how many different spaces and how many different parts need to come together that are different from each other in order to convene that?
I've often found that we can have a knee-jerk response even to the phenomenon of cancel culture. So people who tend to be older, I see this in higher ed where I work and live, very quick to cancel people because they said a particular thing or, couldn't stop from, I don't know, doing X, Y, and Z. Yeah. And so on the one hand, I really understand, to me, especially as somebody who has been teaching, doctoral students for the past 17 years, it is the younger generation's rising intolerance, and saying no more, we're not going to tolerate this. And I think if you look at it that way, it's a good thing. Across sort of the board. I think what is happening in terms of the impact, because it has caught like wildfire, right, of cancel, it's so easy to do. And that's where I see the danger. And I think it's really important for us to see both the pros and cons, which is why I really appreciate this question, because it's not an easy solution. If we all engage in this cultural phenomenon of canceling each other on Facebook or even at our places of work, what it has caused is the secondary phenomenon of everyone being afraid of being honest and also being brave. Yeah. Because you're like, oh crap, I may have said that. Like, I wonder if I said something in class or at the meeting sort of last week that I'm about to. And it makes our capacity to be brave a bit more compromised. And as such, so it goes sort of hand in hand. And I think that that's what we're wrestling with now, is this sort of secondary byproduct of people saying no more, we're not going to tolerate it, which initially is a good thing, but a byproduct of that is people are walking on pins and needles and less able and less empowered to be really brave. Because to be sure, each one of us, myself included, have and will have missteps in this work. Period. Because after all, we are an amalgamation of both privileged and subjugated identities, all of us.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think it really warrants much more thought, an analysis, and our thoughtful conversation around it.
I love that so much. I love that. An amalgamation of both. I hadn't thought of it that way, but it's so true. I mean, the social constructs that we do create, whether we do that consciously or subconsciously, end up, as this fly rotates here, end up, defining us, whether we're aware of it or not. And I find that the more we become reflective as opposed to reactive, we have those moments where we can listen to ourselves, understand our triggers, and then understand maybe what triggers other folks when we allow for those spaces to exist. But it's an ongoing work, right? Once you've done the work for one person, doesn't mean it's going to be the same for another person, because there's nuance there. Okay. There's another question in the audience. Kara wants to know, can you all share an example of a true difficult conversation you had recently, and how did you handle it? So Anastasia, maybe because you and Mike had a fight, and then you're not invited to the birthday party, but outside of that.
Listen, I have all kinds of love for Mike. Yeah. And this is the cognitive reframe. I don't know Mike. I literally met Mike, what is it, an hour ago. But because we are here together, I want to sort of trust, and we take risks with people we trust. That's the nature of psychotherapy, for instance, speaking as a psychotherapist, right? So I think that we take risks when we feel brave, and we feel brave because we trust. And we are able to trust when we have proximity and give goodwill and offer goodwill, to invoke John here, on one another. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we lost John, so we're working to bring him back. But I'm curious, though, do you have any conversations, any examples? I know it's hard to think of on the spot, but if you've had, I don't know, tough conversations with families that you can share, or in the workspace where you found yourself so triggered that you have to practice exactly every single thing that you're preaching today. It's okay if you don't have one, if none comes to mind right now. But yeah, Karen wants to know.
All the time. I have it all the time, and I have to and I wrote a book on it. I created a model, blah, blah, blah. And I do it. I have missteps constantly.
Yeah.
I think really the most difficult conversations that I have, and I suspect that others have, are with those that we love, our family members and our friends. With my colleagues, at a faculty meeting, I'm like, that's just who she is. And she's very special. So we're going to leave her alone. I'm going to do this. And she sits there and I sit here, and, we can not cross paths. But when it's your family member or loved one, it's very difficult. Some of the ones that I have recently had is actually in my family with my daughter, who is a social justice warrior. And I'm like, no, don't bring it home. Mommy does this at work. Can we just have calm dinner? But because she is really bringing it, and she'll catch us, myself and her dad, saying like, don't say that, that's sexist, or don't say that, that's whatever. And we're like, oh, Serena, not now. But she's like, and then she'll tell me, she's like, you listen to what your husband sort of said. Can you please, chime in here? And I have, there are times when I absolutely have, and other times that I'm like, not now. I'm so tired. So I can't think of a specific example off the top of my head. But there have been many. And what I want to say, more than sharing a perfect illustration, is that of our willingness to keep coming back and back. And because it's my daughter, because it's my husband, because it's my son, we have to. And in the moment, it could feel really uncomfortable. It can feel very messy, but you invest and keep going back to the person. Yeah. Don't measure the success of a successful, don't measure the efficacy of a constructive conversation by how you feel at the end, because that is often not accurate. If you leave the gym and you are sore, that's a good thing, so I want to use that parallel.
I love this so much because, like you, Anastasia, I operate in the higher ed field and workspaces, and I actually wrote a book in communication as well. But it doesn't mean because I wrote a book in communication that I don't struggle with it. Because one of the things I know personally about myself is I'm very petty. And it served me in a good and bad way. But a question I have for you is this idea of resentment. I'm going to frame it this way. COVID, people have different ideas of that. It is literally causing divides in families and workspaces, depending on what side you are. The war in Afghanistan, it's 20-year war, immigrant debates, the politics, in your state, California, the recall elections, what's been happening with how people divide and allocate resources. All these things, in my observation as a practitioner, I've seen a lot of resentment being built up. Sometimes they might not even have been aware of those resentment, but that resentment is usually channeled at people they love, they used to love, former best friends. And it's even deeper than a lot of what you've all have shared today, because I think for them, it's like they're coming to terms with the fact that this person's paradigm shift is so different from who I've known for so long that I cannot even see a possible advancement forward. What do you say to that? Because resentment is a real thing. And I don't know that many people feel like there's a way forward once every time they see someone, they get irritated and they get aggravated and they can't move forward. What would you say to those people struggling with that resentment feeling right now?
You're asking me?
Yeah, well, everyone, because I feel like I saw everyone nutted at, because I know I see it in my line of life every day, but I'm curious though, because, if someone doesn't accept you for who you are, or someone doesn't take something that you feel like is safe or do anything, I feel like everybody gets affected by this in some shape or form. But I'm curious to see if you've chosen or come up with a safe way, brave way to come up with boundaries for yourselves in those moments.
I'll just say this very briefly, and this is my training as a psychologist and as a clinician, is for us to have an opportunity to go deep. So I mentioned earlier about being just enhancing and amplifying our emotional intelligence and how that's good for everyone. And when there are intractable, difficult emotions such as sort of resentment, just stop and pause, whether you're experiencing it or you're on the receiving end of it. So pause, don't, resist the pull to have this knee-jerk reaction. Pause and stop and ask, like, what is it? And maybe you name it accurately as resentment. And then people often stop and feel some kind of way about it. And then that becomes the precursor to whatever behaviors they enact. But there is an important step before that. What is it? And then why? Yeah. So regardless of whether it's resentment, anger, hopelessness, despair, anxiety, sort of fear, if you go deep dive into it, often for us individually and collectively, are traumas that are unresolved, are pains that have not been amended, or injuries within our sort of selves, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually. And those tend to bubble up to the surface as things like resentment and anger and hopelessness. So really, I mean, John said this earlier. I'm sorry he's not here. Couples therapy, family sort of therapy. There's a lot that we can gain from that. You don't engage people at the surface, or what we call above, these sort of superficial secondary emotions, but deep down, drilling deep down into primary emotions of pain and hurt. Yeah. Regardless of what the issue, people are often acting some kind of a way or having some kind of strong emotions because they feel unheard, because they feel like no one cares, they don't belong, or they feel threatened that the position that they have might be taken away from them. And that is really scary. Yeah. So I think speaking at the level of hurt, which is vulnerable emotions, can be really, really powerful. And in my opinion, vulnerability is the single most underutilized and yet most powerful emotion in human history, honestly. Because fundamentally we are social, emotional animals, and we are wired for connection. And vulnerability helps us. We are wired to lean in. If you see somebody, regardless of political party, what they believe in, walking down the street and they fall, you're like, oh, you may not help, but you might, you have sort of this, we are wired that way fundamentally, neurocognitively, biologically. So that's what I would say.
I love that.
I think if I can add in there, I think some of the things you can do to help, make that conversation easier, I guess, is to, think about those things where you can find agreement. And if you can find agreement on your values and your principles, we can often do that when our politics disagree. If we can get down to the core about what we believe, and Tayo, you used at the beginning one of my favorite words, dignity. For me, it's all about a world where all people can live their life with dignity. And that's kind of my core value. So if we can strip it down to that, I can usually find some level of agreement with somebody, and then we might have to build it back to where we disagree. But, knowing that we're both coming from places of love and compassion and genuine concern about the world around us, we're able to be more respectful. We're so polarized today that if we disagree on one little thing, I immediately think I know all the other things you believe, and we're just going to line up. And it's like we've got to fight to the death over this issue. The weight of the world is not on this conversation. Yeah. We can step back a little bit. And I think some of the best ways to do it, and this is really to what Anastasia was saying, is, open yourself up to learning from them. A lecture is not a conversation. How can I expect the person I'm talking to be willing to be moved if I'm not willing to be moved? Now, I'm not, there's only so far I'm going to go. But if I approach the conversation with a genuine authenticity and a genuine interest in helping, in understanding why this person believes what they do, by asking questions, and not in a condescending way, like I'm going to get you, I'm going to find the flaw in your logic, but a genuine questioning to get to the root of your values and why you believe the things you do. Right. That's the sort of approach I think you have to take to really be able to connect with somebody.
Right. Well, I might hop in here to offer something that, I mean, a little bit different from that is, I think what I'm often thinking about is how do we see the particular realities of our differences? Right. And I think that's something that comes up for me I mean, if I think about the shock of the 2016 election, for instance, in my like liberal West Coast city, it was that so many of us just had no idea, had no expectation that people felt differently, that people had different stories that were informing what they were believing and doing. And so I think for me, a lot of it comes back to not only pulling it back to story and the realities of just that we are different, that we aren't going to agree, that there are going to be some places that we don't agree, but continuing to see people's humanity in spite of that. Continuing to particularly name the places where pain and hurt and harm have happened. Yeah. Because I think often our search for agreement, our search for common ground, and this is not to pick on Mike again, like everyone else. So many birthday parties he's not going to now. But genuinely, I think part of our learning, you know, as a team has even been, how do we name what hasn't been named? So like thinking back to your question about an example, for instance, I'll just name the imperfections of my own work, right? So we were doing a racial justice series. We were having affinity spaces, white folks, BIPOC folks. And we had put all the BIPOC folks kind of in one group, particularly because it was an overwhelmingly Black group. And this is me, I'm not Black, you know, but this is what we were doing in light of the community. And we had gotten a response from a Latino member of that series who said like, hey, I'm not here, you know, like all I hear is this is the Black group and this is the white group. And we had explicitly not phrased it like that because again, me, you know, I'm not in either of those spaces myself. But we had to, you know, I reached out to him, did not hear anything back. And that's kind of the reality too, is that some people are going to name that boundary. But we had to have a real conversation as a leadership team, as a community of participants of, okay, we can't continue this conversation as we plan to. We have to address the fact that something about what has happened here has unintentionally excluded people. We have to address the fact that we have caused some harm in our good intentions ourselves, and naming what has been hurt itself. I think one of my favorite quotes about boundaries from Prentice Hemphill, who's a somatics practitioner and a great activist and speaker in general, is that boundaries, I'm going to mess this up, but boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and myself simultaneously. And I think for me, that's what it comes down to is sometimes there's going to be, we have to define what that distance, what that space that we have and don't have together looks like. And even check in about that in our bodies, in our stories, and bigger than just our intellect and our beliefs.
I love that. And welcome back. We have John. John is back. John is back. And so, John, this is what I'm going to do because I want you to be really involved in conversations. And I know you have a lot of input here. I know we have a few minutes here, so I'm going to give you ownership of a couple of questions from the audience here. We just to get you up to speed, we've been talking about resentment and how that plays a role, right? That conversation with self and understanding our boundaries. How do we navigate that conversation when it's in front of us and it's tough for us to see past, you know, the emotion of that? And the last couple of questions I see in the audience here, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. Brooks asked, how do I even go about starting these types of conversations? And then Bree asked, I'm personally wondering how I can overcome the anger and rage I feel when trying to do this work. I struggle to keep calm and grounded. Any tips? So both have a similar through line, you know, with the idea of starting and staying grounded and keeping calm. Any thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. Great questions. And yeah, I'm sorry for dropping off. I was canceled, clearly.
Oh, welcome back. We're going to counsel.
There you go. Uncancel the canceling. No, we had a power outage just out of nowhere. So anyway, technology canceled me. Yeah. Yeah, so how do you go about starting these conversations? First of all, it shows self-awareness to be able to think of oneself as somebody who wants to go and start these conversations. One thing I try to stress is that, you know, every situation is not the same. Every individual is not the same. And we really do need to take stock of, you know, what we're ready for, what we want to engage and win, right? But if you're a person who wants to be proactive in starting these sorts of talks, I think that the way to do it is to lead with humility, to be able to demonstrate, and this is a facet of goodwill, I would argue, demonstrate curiosity in soliciting the other party's perspectives and the other party's stories, the stories that lie behind their perspectives, right? Give them the opportunity to display their humanity in a way that creates the space of trust that then purchases the opportunity for you yourself to respond with your perspective, your story, in a psychological and social environment that optimizes the capacity of each party to be genuinely heard, right? So be willing to solicit another individual's perspectives and to deeply listen, not just listen to respond, right? So that's one bit of advice for how we start these conversations. As far as how do we overcome the internal sort of, bitterness, anger that we might have, it's a tough thing, of course. I think that one thing that helps a great deal in stimulating, a certain sense of compassion and understanding, even towards people who seem to be incredibly far gone in their attitudes, perspectives, points of view, is to remember the fact that we are all, in one way or the other, I think, the product of our experiences, the product of our own stories, the product of having been placed in the world in a certain position from a certain vantage point with a certain particular individual psychological chemistry through which we inevitably filter our experiences and our observations in a certain way. And what you see coming from individuals is a product of that. This doesn't deny the need for accountability as a realistic sort of function in social life. This doesn't deny the reality of responsibility, but it does put into context, I think, the reality of certain individuals, all individuals really, points of view and attitudes and behaviors, because none of us really chooses the overall circumstances of our existence. And so if we are fortunate enough to not fall victim to a certain brand of ignorance, to a certain brand of hatred or prejudice or whatever the case may be, that's something for us to be grateful for and to sort of take on board as we evaluate others who may be coming from a very different context in the space of their own personal life, their own personal thoughts, and their own personal experiences. That can make it easier to let go of some of the judgment or some of the animosity that we might otherwise tend to want to hold.
Love it. Love it. Love it. I want to open the floor up for a final word for anyone, because we're getting ready to close. Anything come to mind as you heard John speak, or maybe throughout the whole duration of the hour?
I would just add to what John was saying in those questions, be aware again of your relationship with that person you want to have this conversation with. That will really dictate how far you can probably go with them, how far you can move them. And if it's a very superficial relationship, it's probably at least going to start as a superficial conversation. You have to really build. And then if you want to have a deeper relationship, or if you want to have a deeper conversation, you need to build a deeper relationship with them and, fill out the parts of that relationship before you get to the meat of this big conversation. Or if it's a very superficial one, realize that, you're not going to change a lifetime of thinking for this person in a few minutes.
Well said.
I really appreciate that question about how do we stay in it. This is exhausting work, I think, for those of us and for those folks out there who also identify with any subjugated identities. It is a very personal and personally very painful. I think in my own experience, it's been very important that I seek refuge in folks who really understand, where I can really be myself, for affirmation, for validation, and for a collective empowerment to continue to have stamina for the long haul. I think that's imperative. Also very important to be okay, to not be okay. That, sometimes there is such a push, like, can you not be so angry? Can you not be XYZ? Can you make it palatable? Can you calm down? Can you say it without sort of yelling? And I want to be very clear before we wrap up that, anger and rage, I don't mean by any stretch of the imagination, is something that needs to be diluted. Often, if anger and rage is something that is being held and experienced and expressed by those on the downside of power, it is righteous anger and righteous rage. And we have to really look at that very carefully, because that is the symptom, a very important symptom of the disease of systemic oppression. And, I know that we're speaking to artists and journalists. I'm not either. I envy artists and journalists in many ways, because I think they are uniquely positioned to inspire hope and help challenge, interrogate injustice, and help bridge divides, because their work comes in and fills in those important spaces where I feel like conversation alone fail us. So it's opportunity to really cross-pollinate and work in collaboration together. Feel humbled by an opportunity to address those folks who are artists and journalists.
Wow, beautifully said. I wish we had more time, because there's so much we could get into, but I want to thank you all. This has been such an insightful discussion, and I love what you had to say, Mary Pauline, Mike, John, and Anastasia, and hopefully the audience will have opportunities to extend the conversations. Please look each one of these esteemed panelists up. They're doing amazing things. They all have resources, frameworks that you can get and buy, support, and share with your family. So I would encourage you all to do that. But that concludes our discussion today, as well as the second day of our Peace Studio Summit. Thank you all for tuning in. Please join us again at 10 a.m. Eastern tomorrow for our final day of programming, ending in our big finale at 8 p.m. Eastern. Thank you so much.